Welcome to Booked All Night Season 2. Each week, Jess, Katie, and Maggie launch into new worlds, discover amazing characters, and bring you the best bookish discussions under the stars. We're a cozy little corner of the internet, so be sure to leave a comment and join the polls after each episode. And don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss a chapter. Alright, my little Libranauts, grab a seat, grab a book, and join us as we explore some new pages. So as I was saying when we were off recording, it was really fun to dive back into some Tolkien because I haven't touched any since 2008 when I had a class on it, which was really great because we got to read on fairy stories, we touched on some of the Silmarillion, we did the entire trilogy in 15 weeks, which I do not recommend doing because I think I'm still burnt out from it. But it was so great to just deep dive into that and discuss it and then take it to my other classes and just be like, fantasy, yay.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember when I was in college, I was an English major in college, and when I was early in my undergrad, there was like some professor doing a class on Tolkien for one semester, and I was like, oh, I want to be in that class. And I went and showed up, and it was like standing room only. And the professor was like, oh, if you are not actually assigned to this class, there's no way you're actually going to be able to do it. And I didn't have like the persistence enough at the time to be like, no, I'm just going to stand here in the back and just pretend like I'm in the class. I should have done that for that semester because she never taught it again while I was at school. So I missed it. So I guess I started my own podcast as sort of my own self-compensation, my own consolation prize of, I didn't get to study this in school, so I'm just going to do it on my own.
Yeah. Be like, I'll make my own Tolkien class with blackjack and hooker stuff. The class that I had was up at the University of Vermont, and he teaches it every year because they also host a Tolkien conference there. Even that was super fun because then you had all these people that came from off campus to talk and present as well, to just talk and be like, here's what I see in that, and here's how it applies to other fantasy, here's how I think it comes into the world, because Tolkien's world obviously is so incredibly expansive, and we still use it today as like a masterclass on building out your fantasy and world building in general. One of the things I always remember someone saying about it was he's a really great example of building out lore as opposed to building out the world, right? You don't just be like, here's the elves and they believe this. He's like, okay, here's a people and here are the stories that make them believe what they believe, which ties into making it feel a little bit more realistic, which is always funny to say about fantasy, where you're like, it's just not believable. Well, yeah, it's fantasy. It doesn't have to be 100%, but it does a little bit, which is part of the message that On Fairy Stories has, right? Where he's like, it still has to have that thread of credibility to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, one of those principles in On Fairy Stories is that inner consistency of reality. Right? And that the rules of that world have to be consistent in and of themselves. And he gives this great example of a green sun. Like, it's easy to say in fantasy, okay, here's a new world that you haven't experienced where the sun is green. But what does that actually mean from like a scientific standpoint to say that the sun is green? Like, would trees still have green leaves?
Yeah.
Would the water still shine blue? Would the sky be blue? Like, you have to like think through what are all of those logical implications of saying that the sun is green. And that's what gives an inner consistency of reality within the world itself.
Yeah. I also love the example. I'm talking over everybody else. If anybody else wants to chime in. But I love the example of the green sun because it's something that when you're kind of talking about like setting the scene, there are so many things that are just little things that'll pop you out of the story. And most fantasy readers obviously have a higher suspension of disbelief, but it'll be like this little thing that pops you out. And I just been thinking about how many books we've read in season 1 where something little just popped us out and we talked about it for like 40 minutes instead of what actually happened in those 10 chapter gaps. And
not Rob's real estate career going on about the stuff we cut from House at Tatterley.
Yeah.
I'm specifically thinking of the bus in the Alicia Jasinska book.
Oh, goodness, yeah.
Yeah, we were like, wait, there's a bus in this fantasy story? How does technology work? And then we just went off and like the plot of the story no longer mattered because we were just thrown from it. And it feels like something so inconsequential, but it is something really big. And sometimes it's even just like character interaction. Like, I was thinking about like how something changes, right? One of the most believable things to me in The Hobbit is that somebody showed up on the door and didn't go away the first time that you told them to go away, right? Gandalf comes up and he's like, knock, knock, I have an adventure. And Bilbo's like, oh, God, gross, no. But if Gandalf had just walked away, that would be the most unbelievable thing to me, because nobody around here just walks away. And that's more believable than dragons and dwarves and treasure and, you know, miraculously hitting one loose little scale. I love that. I love that about fantasy stories, that it's really these things that are the most realistic, but we set them up upon fantastical elements. I just love that.
Just building off of that, I love the one thing that came out of this that really stood out to me was the idea of secondary worlds and secondary belief. As a writer and as someone who studied communication, one of the first things that you come to understand is that what you tell somebody is not necessarily what they're going to get out of what you tell them.
Right.
Communication, you know, you have your communicator, you have your receiver, you have your message, you have your medium. And because of the nature of language and because of the nature of words, what a chair is to me is not going to be what a chair is to you. So when I say chair, I might be thinking of like, you know, a nice wooden chair or something, and somebody else might come back with like a roller chair or something like that. And I think one of the beautiful things about fantasy, and Tolkien touches on this a bit near the end, is the idea that it does require that second person to kind of fill in the details of the world on their own. Fantasy done right is not an individual thing.
Yeah, I really love what you're saying there, Rob, especially the idea of the creation of the subworld or the secondary world within the reader's mind. And I think for Tolkien, that's why literature was like the highest form of art, was because every other form of art, it took some of the audience members' imagination away. Like if you look at a piece of painting, you don't have to imagine the visual anymore. If you're watching a play or a drama, like part of your imagination doesn't have to be involved. But when you're reading literature and the author says, oh, there's a hobbit who lived in a hole, like, boom, all of a sudden your imagination is activated and you're like, da-da-da-da-da. But then he has to say, no, this wasn't an oozy hole filled with worms or whatever. It was a hobbit hole. And so all of a sudden you're like, I've never encountered a hobbit hole before. Tell me more about this, Tolkien. And he goes on and on and on and on. And so it's like you have this dance back and forth between an author and a reader of saying, let me tell you this thing that you have experience with, but it's different than what you've experienced before. And here are some details. And we're going to sub-create together across the expanse of time and distance. We're going to sub-create this beautiful secondary world together. And I think for Tolkien, that was why literature was the highest form of art.
Yes. I love that example too. So when I was an undergrad, one of the messages of our program was that writing is social. And it took me a very long time to understand what they meant. And that's one of the examples, is that when I give you a chair, you, the reader, imagine the chair. I can't paint the chair for you as a writer. It was that, like a few other instances, that finally got me to come around to the idea that writing is social, because the rest of it, I'm like, no, it's not. I sit in a room and I do it by myself. What do you?
Yes, I'm an introvert. Yeah. I don't want to be social.
I don't talk to anybody. What are you talking about? And I talked to like one other person about my writing. I have no idea what you mean by writing is social, but it is. And I think it was Stephen King who calls it a form of time travel in that instance, that, you know, Tolkien, the trilogy is published in like the late 50s, right? And here we are reading it today and still getting images. And how is that not a form of time travel if you really want to get like super bougie and theoretical about things? I agree. Like, that's part of what makes literature and writing one of these beautiful pieces of art, because if I play, as you said, if I play music for you, you hear music. There's nothing for you to input there. And if I show you art, there's no art for you. But literature, especially if you get into a lot of critical theory, like reader response is my favorite piece of critical theory now that I'm out of school. But it's we bring ourselves to literature. We bring our experiences, our education, and our world to that. So if, as Rob said, like, oh, you might be thinking of a rolling chair, but if I've never seen a rolling chair is not going to be what I think about. And if I've only ever seen a gross little hole, that gross little hole is going to be the only thing I'm ever thinking about instead of the Hobbit hole. And even if you have a broader sense of experience, then you get into Derrida and de Saussure, where I don't get to use my education often, so I'm just going to drop all these names. It's fine for everybody. And I always get them mixed up, but the theories go together. And one is to say one word, one meaning, and the other is one word, multiple meanings. And a tree is a perfect example of that. If I say tree, somebody's going to think of a pine tree, somebody's going to think of a willow tree, someone's going to think of a maple, someone's going to think of a palm. And it all just comes back to reader response, which is it depends on our relationship to that word and our experience with that word and that world.
Yeah, and for some authors I can imagine that would be highly frustrating because you as an author have a vision in your mind of this story that you're trying to tell and the world that it takes place in, and you're trying to describe it, but yet words, as Rob was mentioning before, words and language and communication, it's not as easy as saying, let me telepathically give this vision in my mind into your mind, right? It's this whole, you're communicating through this textual language. If I may, there's a quote from Tolkien on fairy stories that I want to read. It's a little bit long, but it speaks perfectly to this. And it's right at the beginning of his essay on fairy stories. He says this: "The land of fairy story is wide and deep and high, and is filled with many things. All manner of beasts and birds are found there, shoreless seas and stars uncounted, beauty that is an enchantment, and an ever-present peril, both sorrow and joy as sharp as swords. In that land a man may, perhaps, count himself fortunate to have wandered, but its very riches and strangeness make dumb the traveler who would report it. And while he is there, it is dangerous for him to ask too many questions, lest the gates shut and the keys be lost. The fairy gold too often turns to withered leaves when it is brought away. All I can ask is that you, knowing these things, will receive my withered leaves as a token that my hand at least once held a little of the gold."
I love that.
I did love that quote.
That is a beautiful, beautiful idea. If with beautiful language, I mean, it's just like, it's so, like Tolkien has these beautiful things that he wants to share. And he's like, look, you can't always pull these things out of this world of fairy, this world of fantasy, and communicate them into the real world. He's like, all I can offer you is, here are these withered leaves, but just trust me that once they were beautiful gold, and you just have to go to the land of fairy, and then you'll see the beautiful gold.
Right? Like, you just have to let your mind wander there. And it's hard for some people. Sometimes, like, fantasy's not your genre. And so, oh my God, the amount of times that Maggie and I have heard this in workshops, I just don't do fantasy. And so it's like, okay, but you do stories. So does it make sense that this guy wants to kill somebody else based on what you know about him? I think as it comes to story, a lot of people get hung up on setting and genre, and they're like, well, it's not my thing to read that. Like, but it could be if you gave it a chance. And if you just like here are the leaves, and I promise you they were beautiful, and if you just come with me, you can see them alive on the tree, and it will be wonderful, and you will experience such a wonderful story full of lovely metaphors that fit to today's political socioeconomic issues. And like, that's a whole different podcast episode to argue about how fantasy plays on that. But why wouldn't you want to read something like that? Why wouldn't you want to experience something like that? And he does say it in here, where a lot of people think that fairy stories and fantasy and genre and things like that are for children.
Right.
And I would like to say that we've come, I believe, away from that, right? Like, romantasy, for example, is a perfect example of that. That romantasy is not for children. A public service announcement from Jess from Booked All Night. Just...
Literally picked up a book that said this is not intended for a younger audience, that was shelved in fantasy.
I think as we get older, we want to put things that we did as children away, because we were like, well, when I was a kid, I loved unicorns, but obviously that's only because they're for children. And we don't bring that enjoyment with us to adulthood, and we don't want to.
I want to be taken seriously.
Yeah. There's definitely some guy in your MFA class right now, like, you can't write fantasy. fantasy is for boring little things, and here is my 15-word sentence, and I've decided to call it a novella, and I'm perfect. And like,
it's the things that you encounter as a child, and it's kind of relates from both the acceptance that fantasy is derived for children and it's a childish aspect, but it's also the point of your life where you are the most open to fresh ideas, new ideas, something different, something strange. And if you're able to carry that from your youth through to adulthood and continue in sort of taking that fantasy into yourself, it leads a lot to the escapism that fantasy tends to provide for a lot of readers, that you don't necessarily want to be aware of what's going on around you necessarily for just a little bit, and you're able to escape to this fantastic world of dragons and hobbits and elves for however long you want to, and you can have this sort of moment where you can find peace in yourself and in reading this fantasy book. And that's something that a lot of people tend to give up if they don't continue on with that fantasy past childhood.
Yeah, he brought up some stuff there. One about children, that they have the unblunted edge of belief, right? Like the heightened sense of disbelief. And I think about that a lot because obviously I write for children, and if I want to start a picture book with like, so a wizard walked into a library riding a dinosaur, it's perfectly plausible. And we don't have to go into why it does. But if I were to do that with like a YA book, we'd be like, hold up. What world do we live in that these things all coexist, and why is he doing that? And I need the details.
Okay, but that, frankly, is a great opening line for a YA book, or even, hell, an adult book. I would read that in a heartbeat. You give me wizard riding into a library on the back of a dinosaur, and I will read every single word of it.
He's returning his copies of whatever book he was reading. It's important that you get those back on time. But yeah, like I have a middle grade piece, and one of the openings is the sky was dark and full of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. That's appropriate for middle grade. It's not appropriate for adult fiction, because an adult would be like, why is it full of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches? They don't fly in the sky. Oh, how dare you? But I do want to come back to the escapism, because he's got the, there's a word. It's kind of like qualifications. He's got like a list of things that fantasy should contain, right? And escape is one of them. The fairy story should provide comfort, escape, and consolation. And I think fantasy often provides that, right? You are comforted because even if it takes a while, the bad guys usually get punished and get their comeuppance for whatever they have done. We have the escape, as you were saying, that our world sucks, but this fantasy world is really cool and pretty, and I would rather be here than what I am experiencing in the real world. And the consolation, like through your happy endings, you're kind of getting this this justice according to your moral code. That's why we tend to read certain authors or certain types of books, because we're like, okay, this person did a bad thing, they got punished for it, and now they are in magical jail for the rest of eternity. This is perfect. It aligns with my worldview that bad people should go to magical jail for all eternity.
Tolkien did point out at one point that he actually preferred certain, not necessarily bowdlerized, but updated, modernized takes on certain fairy stories, specifically because they allowed for both justice and mercy in equal measure.
Yes.
Whereas in the works that he had originally referenced, the original fairy book would allow the villains to go off and live on very hearty pensions, or people would die for no reason. Whereas in the newer versions, he was able to see worlds in which virtue could take place in both forms. And being able to approach a world like this allows us to assess those values, allows us to even enjoy those values in ways that we wouldn't otherwise be able to.
I was actually I was complaining first and then talking about something similar. I had recently played the new Dragon Age Veilguard game, and a lot of the racism has been taken out of it. And obviously I'm not like, oh my god, put racism back in my games. How dare you take racism out and present a world without it? But fantasy is a really great place to explore that, especially for an audience that doesn't experience that, right? I'm a straight white girl. I don't experience racism, but you can see it and experience it in a game and in fiction. And so to erase it from a world makes it feel unrealistic, which is a weird thing to say about fantasy. But this is part of the argument that Tolkien is making, is that there should be some semblance of realism, right? Like, even in Tolkien's world, dwarves and elves don't like each other.
Right. And it's not necessarily consistency or logical sense with our world, with the primary world, but it's more like in the rules of that world, the secondary world, are those rules consistent in and of themselves? And they need some explanation to them, but you don't have to go into like huge treaties, right, about all the things. And it's like elves and dwarves are different. Their natures are different. Their origin stories are different, and they have different natures and different motivations. And yes, we can paint with broad strokes, but at the end of the day, elves and dwarves are different, right? And they don't like each other. And it's not that they hate each other, that they're enemies. It's just that there's more like a sibling rivalry between elves and dwarves, right? And so it's like, well, what are the reasons for that? And, you know, sometimes you get little hints of the history, like in the Hobbit movies, you get a little bit of this, and in the Peter Jackson films, you get a little bit of that history. But it's not until you go and like you read the Silmarillion and you find out, oh, there was like some actual like slaying between elves and dwarves, and other things beside, where you realize, okay, I can see now why these two races don't generally get together most of the time, and why it is such a unique thing that in the Second Age that elves and dwarves are coming together. Oh, and also such a unique thing that elves and dwarves are working together in the Third Age, right? And so it's like within the rules of the story of Middle Earth, it has to make sense, right? And so I don't know the game that you're referencing, but
you should play it.
I'm
Everybody
sorry.
should play Dragon Age.
I'm sure, right? But it's really tough to be like, okay, I need to now suspend the rules of my primary world and download a new set of rules, and what makes sense in this world, what actually makes logical sense to this world. And if the set of rules is different than the primary world, then I need to be aware of that. I need to be made known. That needs to be manifested to me as a reader.
Yeah. As a consumer, like
right,
especially as it comes to fantasy, the history of the world, I believe, is important, which kind of comes back to the like build lore and not the world, right? Because as we reference why these two things don't get along with each other, we're referencing like, okay, well, there was, you know, stuff with the Maiar, there was stuff with the slaying, there was stuff with this treaty and this broken thing and that and then that and that. But if it was just like they just don't get along, that's less easy to like put yourself into, to just have this disbelief. Right. And
it's telling rather than showing, right? It's like if Tolkien just said, hey, elves and dwarves don't like each other, well, okay, like why? So what? Who cares? You know, like, okay, big deal. And so it's like, no, there has to be some depth and some complexity to that, and you have to show it. You have to show it just enough so that people understand, not so much, but just enough, so that those rules make sense within the world.
Yeah. I had like a list of things that popped me out of stories for like things that don't make sense in the worlds. And one of them was in the Peter Jackson films when the Uruk is twitching beneath Gimli, and he's like, oh, that one's still alive. And he's like, well, he's twitching because my axe is embedded in his nervous system.
And it's nervous system.
Yeah, that line has always popped me out, because I'm like, how does Gimli know about the nervous system? And it's such a weird thing to pop out on, because it's like, well, wouldn't a warrior know about the things that make the body move? And wouldn't he have seen enough blood and gore? But like, I've never seen that in the context of this book or this film. And so how does he know about this? And then that's the only thing that I can focus on. And I've then lost the thread of the story and the conversation. And all I can think about is, why does this dwarf know about this?
Yeah. Or how do orcs know about menus?
Yes.
And why is meat back on the menu, right? Right? Like, there's little things like that do break that consistency. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
Speech is one of them too, where I read like fantasy and the setting is like medieval fantasy, and somebody rolls up in a carriage like, "Get in, loser, we're going shopping in the market today." It's like, what? Why are you talking that way?
You totally just cited something out of Virgil, but at the same time, okay. Incidentally, the internet tells me that the nervous system was discovered in the 3rd century BC, so it's not exactly like it's uncommon knowledge.
Right. And I'm not saying that it is uncommon knowledge. I'm asking how the dwarf knows about the nervous system. Like,
because Gimli is actually a secret PhD, like medical professor.
It took 3 years of orgo and anatomy,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh,
medical school of Erebor.
Only.
Yeah.
Only
experts in dragon anatomy there.
Only 3 years for med school. That's the real fantasy there, right?
That was just an orgo and,
Well,
and
it's
anatomy.
it's the 3rd era, so there's only so much that they know at this point.
Exactly. Jess, you keep talking about lore building rather than world building, and I will say I think Tolkien has an incredibly unfair advantage in this space compared to many other authors, because for him language came to him so naturally, right? He would invent new languages. He said even as a child it came just as natural as breathing, right? And so he turned his professional and academic studies to philology, or the study of the history of language and how it evolves. And he learned there that one of the core concepts of human language is that it's so closely connected with culture, and culture is so connected with story, right? And you can kind of see this revolving flywheel of language, story, culture, and kind of how all of these things affect and mold each other along the way. And, for Tolkien, he had these invented languages up in his mind of, this is how elves speak, and this is how dwarves speak. He had all of these different languages, 17 different languages, popping out of his mind. And it's not until his friend C.S. Lewis comes along, talk about the collaboration, the social aspect of writing, right? C.S. Lewis comes along and says, Tolkien, you need to write some stories to go with your languages. And Tolkien's like, yes, that's absolutely true. What story would these languages evolve from? And that's where you start to get some of his myths and Lord of the Rings and all that. I'm simplifying this down to like really simple things, but at the high level gist of the story is it's like Tolkien has these languages. He needs to create a story for them. Boom, out we get The Hobbit, we get The Lord of the Rings, we get The Silmarillion. All of this stuff is myth building for decades that I just don't think other authors are even able to really match. Maybe they have their own advantages in that way, but I think when you look at language, culture, lore, mythology, and the stories that get told around all of those things, I think Tolkien just had a super unfair advantage in the world of literature.
I agree 100%. Also because his, in creating those languages, his initial goal was not, I'm creating this language to put it into a story, where most of us today are, I'm creating this language, I'm creating this world, I'm creating these people, I'm creating this lore, I'm creating this continent and how everything looks to put it into a story. And we are doing that while we write the story, where he was like, I have this beautiful world Bible all ready to go, and all I have to do is figure out some things that happened here, and ta-da, here are the things that happened here. And so it does feel unfair for those of us who are not starting our careers with decades worth of education and languages and other things behind us. But at the same time, it's really great to learn from that, because it's like, look what he did by doing that first and having those things organized and knowing the picture of things and knowing what things were called and knowing what led them to be there. Because in having an understanding of the culture, he already had reasons for dwarves and elves not to like each other, for hobbits to be like, you know what, the rest of you can burn down. I would like to be here in my garden. I don't care what's going on outside of Hobbiton. Like, this is, the Shire is where it's at. Please don't knock on my door. Like, to have that versus going through and exploring your story, as I know Maggie can attest to, having written many fantasy things, where she gets to a point and she's like, why did this happen? And then you're stuck in what I call 20K limbo, where you've hit 20,000 words and now it's time for you to make decisions, where Tolkien started with these heavy influences on the decisions that would be made. And we don't. we're a little screwed on that front. We're like, well, you have to make decisions. Ha ha ha. I'm like, oh, but can it make it for me? That would be nice.
If I might bring out a long quote myself.
Since
we're talking out of this.
Woo, woo.
Max Miller's view of mythology as a disease of language can be abandoned without regret. Mythology is not a disease at all. You might say that thinking is a disease of the mind. It would be more near to the truth to say that languages, especially modern European languages, are a disease of mythology. I got a nice kick out of that one myself. But language at the same time cannot be dismissed. The incarnate mind, the tongue, and the tail are in our world coeval. The human mind, endowed with the powers of generalization and abstraction, sees not only green grass, discriminating it from other things, but sees that it is green as well as being grass. The mind that thought of the light of heavy, gray, yellow, still, swift, also conceived of magic that would make heavy things light and able to fly, turn gray lead into yellow gold, and still rock into swift water. If it could do the one, it could do the other. And it inevitably did both.
As somebody with anxiety disorders, I would like to say that, in fact, thinking is a disease of the mind.
Well, I really love this thought that you pulled out here from On Fairy Stories here, Rob, and part of it too is Tolkien is saying, like, look, stories are a real thing. They are a real thing that exist, and yes, your mind exists and your tongue exists, and just because you can see those and touch those and experience those with different senses, like, that doesn't make them any more or less real than a story.
Yeah.
Right? And the beautiful thing about the human mind, I think is what Tolkien's saying here, the beautiful thing about the human mind is we can perceive realistic things. We can also perceive imaginary things. And to our minds, they can both be real. Mm-hmm. And I think that really speaks to the power of story, the power of tales and fairy stories, as Tolkien is saying here, is like, even though something is just an idea, even though it's just thinking or imagination, it can still be real to us as human beings. Right? And that's why we cry when we watch Lord of the Rings and Aragorn comes to the hobbits and says, you bow to no one, and everybody in the kingdom bows to the hobbits, and oh yes, we're all crying right now, like, even though we know hobbits aren't real, Gondor's not real, Aragorn's not real, Middle-earth's not real, but yet it is, in some imaginary sense, it's real to us, and we can feel those same feelings and have a story be as real as our mind or our tongue that is able to create or tell the story itself.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I do want to talk about, like, the reality of story, because as someone that writes for children, any story that presents to them, if they can fall in love with it to a point that it is real for them. Like, look at the Harry Potter franchise and how heartbroken a lot of adults were when J.K. Rowling came out to be J.K. Rowling. And we were all like, but Hogwarts is my home. This was a place that I felt welcome. This was a place that I could easily identify who and what and where I was and what I was meant to be doing and who I was meant to be. And these stories gave me the language to define that for myself. And to have that taken away in any sense, it just ripped some people apart because of how attached we can get to story and how story attaches to us, and kind of coming back to reader response, where I might be in a place in my life that I need something to help me escape what is going wrong. And so I need something to see myself and to see myself be successful. Mm-hmm. Like, maybe I see myself as a hobbit, right? And this hobbit went through a lot of work to get this ring clear across the continent, and at the end actually gets recognized for that work, right? Maybe I'm in that place. Maybe I'm in a place where I'm incredibly competitive and I need to see my short, fat friend win against a very talented elf who is much taller and a little more graceful, right? There are things that our audience is going to see and interact with that might not have been our plan as creator. Mm-hmm. And that's a whole... I could talk audience interaction theory for
goodness.
Like, regardless of the reality of it, the emotions are and always will be real to both us as the creators, but also as the readers.
Yeah.
Regardless of what, where it comes from and the details of what you're reading, you connect not necessarily with the fantasy elements themselves, as cool as they are, as much as I would love to have a real dragon in my life.
Yeah, why don't
you
we?
connect you connect with the emotion of it. You connect with the story, like the heart of the story.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it everlasting.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's an element of truth. Truth in the primary world that can be abstracted and shown in the imaginary world that I think fantasy and fairy stories really lends itself well to in that. And especially on the idea of like escapism. Like escapism, yes, that's one half of the coin, but the other half of the coin is recovery, right? Is that we've escaped our primary world and we've seen things through a different lens. Maybe it was through the eyes of a hobbit or through the eyes of a wizard or the eyes of a teenage wizard going to Hogwarts, right? Like we escaped our primary world to experience a new world, but that doesn't mean that we can stay in that imaginary world. We need to experience some level of recovery, right? Which, to quote Tolkien again, he said, recovery is a regaining of a clear view, right? And he says a clear view, so you can come back to the primary world, to your day-to-day life, and you have that clear view, a different, fresh take on things than what you had before.
There was an example that I didn't write down, but it was somebody who had used Final Fantasy games as a form of therapy, and the man had been in a very deep depression and had wanted to kill himself, and his friend was like, go play this game. And the Final Fantasy games, if you're not aware, can often be incredibly depressing. So I don't know why you would be like, hey, my friend's really depressed, play this depressing game. But he does, and he plays the game, and he comes out of it, and he's like, well, things aren't that bad.
It could be worse.
Yeah, it could be worse, right? And there have definitely been some books that I have read in my time where, like, things aren't going great for me. My health isn't great. My mental health goes and takes a dive because, of course, the sun has gone. It's no longer green and shining outside. And then I read a book and, like, the entire world is on fire and there's wizards everywhere and they're riding dragons, but I'm not, which sucks. And maybe there's dinosaurs eating the library, and it's just like, okay, I stubbed my toe today. It's not that bad. And sometimes that comparison is important to see that and to come away and just kind of calm down for a moment and just be like,
it's like it's like a cathartic cry in that sense, in that you let it all out, and whether it's in the medium of an actual cry or, playing a super depressing, complicated, convoluted Square Enix game, it brings that recovery to you because you experience it through that lens, that secondary world lens, that then, you feel it, you experience it, and now you're like, okay, I'm done. I'm okay. I'm good to keep going now.
Yeah, but lens is a great way to put that because the lens provides you distance, right? Now I can see myself, but I can back away from the problem and I can analyze it as if I am not in the problem or causing the problem or part of the problem in any way, which sometimes allows you to be objective as opposed to like, I stubbed my toe hurts, I am subjective about the pain in my toe kind of thing. So I think lens is like a really great way to put that.
Or a safety valve or an outlet for some of these strong emotions that we humans can evoke within ourselves, or that life can channel in us. That fantasy and reading and fiction can be a place to escape and then recover from and have that clear, fresh view of things. I
am just remembering an unfortunate thing of mine in high school. So it's relevant, I swear.
Be sure?
Yes. It was when the fourth Harry Potter book had come out. And, of course, Cedric dies. And when I was in high school, I was a very fast reader. Yeah, right? What?
Just kidding.
It's been like 20 years. Go read a book. Anywho, I went to school the next day after it had been released. I stayed up all night. I read it. And I went to school and I was crying. And my friends were like, oh my God, what happened? And I was like, he's dead. And they were like, who? And I'm like, how far are you in this book? And then I can't tell you because I don't want to spoil things for you. Right. And my teacher sent my ass down to the counselor. And I was like, I can't tell you. I don't want to spoil things for you. And they're like, what is wrong? I'm like, he's dead. It's so sad. And his dad was crying and he was there. And it, like, that is the power of literature, right? Like, this is what we're talking about here, that we can get so emotionally attached. And some of us can get a little deranged about it. But I think that's great to be able to invest yourself so much in story that these things are real. Like, it's beautiful in a way.
Yeah.
Maybe not that I got sent down to the counselor. That's, like, not great. But, like...
Well, I mean, that's an experience for you, right? But Cedric dies, and if there's anything universal about the human experience, it's death, right? We're all going to die someday. We all know someone who has passed away, and, maybe it's happened recently, maybe it hasn't. And Tolkien even spoke about this in On Fairy Stories, right? Mm-hmm. He's like, and lastly, there is the oldest and deepest desire, the great escape, the escape from death. And he even mentioned, like, death is kind of one of the primary themes of Lord of the Rings. And you have this Lord of the Rings, the Silmarillion, these things, this whole mythology from Tolkien could almost be seen as a huge thought experiment of what happens when you have a race of beings who don't experience natural death, the elves, and they're juxtaposed with a race of beings who do experience what we would call natural death, mortal man, and or humankind. And so what happens now with these two coming back and forth and together, and when you go read something like Cedric dies or Dumbledore dies or Gandalf dies, it's like, oh man, that taps into that secondary world within each of us, that universal human experience, and gives us a place to feel that same emotion, and hopefully to come back and recover from to some degree. But I really love that idea.
Yeah.
One of my favorite parts out of all of Tolkien's work, and this is going to sound really weird and out of the blue, but near the very, very end of The Hobbit, when the great battle erupts and all of the armies are now trying to sort each other out, and the ogres or the goblins have come out of the forest, and the men are now siding with the dwarves instead of against them, and Gandalf has come to the field, and there's this moment where Bilbo sees the eagles coming, and it is out of everything that's going on. You have Bilbo's boasting contest, the riddle that he gives to Smaug about who he is and everything he's done on this journey. And Bilbo stops and for the briefest second is in utter awe of the eagles, and then gets conked on the head and misses everything else. And wakes up to find half of his party is dead. Thorin is dying. Yes, everything's been resolved, but he missed so much of it. And now that he's had this epic high, he ends his story on something of an epic low. And for me, the first time I read that, I was in middle school. Seeing the juxtaposition there, I had to go back and forth between the two chapters a little bit, like even in middle school, trying to reconcile the two very distinct emotions that were written there and realizing that, okay, we're seeing both extremes put together. We're seeing epic adventures have epic consequences.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There are...
And as...
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, and Bilbo and Thorin reconciling at the very end after the massive argument that has basically inspired the last three chapters, and realizing, okay, saying goodbye and laying the Arkenstone to rest and everything there, we're at the journey's end, and then he goes home. And the rest of us have to go home with that.
Yeah. The trauma of story. There are in talking about like the polar opposite of where these scenes end, there are some theories in writing that say that you should always end your scene on the opposite emotion of where it started. So if it was happy, it should be sad, and then if it's sad, it should be happy. And then I was like, that's like a really nauseating roller coaster to go through your fiction with if you actually keep up with that. But instead of doing it by scene, I think, you know, like, you do have to have that. You can't just be like, okay, we're going to end on a high and everybody goes home and we're all happy, because that's not believable. Like, there was just a battle of 5 armies. Everybody's alive, right? Like, you have to have this fallout that is kind of realistic. That, okay, we at least got conclusion on the argument, because if Hobbit were written today, I can guarantee you Thorin would die and Bilbo would never get to say anything to him, because that's the kind of trauma that we live with today, is the unspoken communication and apologies. The Smaug probably would have figured out the riddle right away, right? And like, eaten Bilbo. And then Bilbo has to experience the battle from inside Smaug, which would have been ridiculous. But there are so many different emotional. I'm sorry, my brain is like not working right now. What was I was talking about? Emotions. Oh yeah, so there's all the highs and lows, and you have to have that, right? You have to have that contrast, because we live in a world of contrast. We don't really understand darkness without light. So at
the same time, light without darkness.
Exactly. So if everybody lives, what does it matter if nobody died?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like, why is it important?
This idea of death and a character has to die, like, there has to be real peril and real stakes. You know, as Tolkien said, right? In a fairy tale or other world setting, it is a sudden and miraculous grace, never to be counted on to recur. It does not deny the existence of Eucatastrophe, I hope I said that right, or of sorrow and failure, right? But the possibility of these is necessary to the joy of deliverance. Like, you really have to know, like, there can be death and a final ending to things, or else, like, the joy does not seem the same, or the conflict itself does not seem as perilous or as real as it might otherwise seem.
Yeah. I have another story, and I promise this is also relevant. My sister was reading Game of Thrones, and she was reading it well after the series came out, and she was sitting at the table. Me and my husband are there. We're, like, setting up board games or whatever, and my sister's like, oh, well, I'm at the part, and, like, Ned's been arrested, and, like, I know nothing's going to happen to him, because he's, like, the main character. And I had to get up and leave, because I was like, nope. That is untrue. But Tolkien's got a word for when people miraculously get saved, right? It's the Eucatastrophe, where...
The Eucatastrophe, the sudden joyous turn.
Yes, like, oh, well, it's okay, because somebody was there to save Ned. Ha, 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 ha. But no, actually, Ned loses his head, right? I have a lovely list of these Eucatastrophes, right? You've got, you know, thankfully Gollum was stalking Frodo and Sam, so Gollum dies in the fire instead of Frodo, so he's safe from that sense. Tolkien even cited Christ's birth as a Eucatastrophe, because it wasn't convenient that somebody was born to save all of humanity from their sins, like, and we just happen to have that. Isn't that great? The Eagles rescuing Bilbo is another Eucatastrophe. It's just like, oh, well, they came in at the right time to get you out. Aren't you lucky? And then I just went on to, like, a whole list of others, you know, like being able to bend space lasers into an exhaust vent to destroy the Death Star. Dragons are unkillable, except for Smaug, who has this itty-bitty weakness. And aren't you lucky that Bard the Bowman also speaks Thrush and can understand that? Superman can fly the Earth backwards and reverse time, so now Lois Lane's not dead. The Scarecrow catches fire, and the water that Dorothy throws on him just happens to hit the witch, and she dies. Isn't that wonderful? And so now she's dead, and everybody is safe. Like, the common cold kills alien invaders, which is War of the Worlds for anyone who's not as ancient as I happen to be. Like, and again,
so there's it's really tough here, because on the one hand you could say, yeah, that's just, what is it, Deus Ex Machina, right? Like, oh yeah, like God just comes in from the machine and boom, everybody's saved. But there's, I think, slightly different than how Tolkien would look at Eucatastrophe, because Eucatastrophe is something like, it's not necessarily looked for. It's not like the characters are counting on some good, joyous turn. Like, for them, they're in the deepest moment of despair and darkness, and they think they've lost. They think they've lost.
Yeah.
The heroes, the good people, whoever they are, they think they've lost. But something happens that you didn't see coming, but when you look retroactively, it's like, oh, of course, right? Bilbo sees the eagles coming. Well, the eagles were set up before, so long ago, but yet, oh, they come back, right? Or you have the charge of the Rohirrim on the fields of Pelennor outside of Minas Tirith, right? It's like, that is a catastrophic moment, because everybody in Gondor thinks, this is it. This is the final. We're gone. The gate's been breached. Our steward is going crazy. This is the end. And then all of a sudden Rohan shows up, right? And so it's like, for them, it was completely unlooked for, but not entirely unforeshadowed.
Yeah.
I know there's a lot of negatives, double negatives in there, but there is some degree of prediction or setup, but not for the characters themselves.
Yes.
Right? So, yeah.
I mean, one of the things that, like you mentioned, it's been a bit since I've read The Return of the King, but correct me if I'm wrong. As the ring finally plummets into Mount Doom, I believe Tolkien, as the narrator, comments on the fact that this might have been the purpose all along of Gollum being with the group, was to do this final action when Frodo could not. And it's an interesting bit that the book takes an aside to speculate, okay, did all of the suffering, everything that has happened, intentionally lead up to this moment?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think one that Tolkien even grappled with a lot. And, because Tolkien even wrote in some of his letters about how Frodo failed. Frodo failed the mission. He claimed the ring for himself there at the end of all things, right? And so, would Sam have been able to wrestle the ring away from Frodo?
Or push him in?
Because he loved Frodo so dearly? Would the Nazgul, as soon as they realized where the ring was, they come, and Tolkien even imagined this scene of the Nazgul coming to Mount Doom and sort of feigning obedience, because Frodo's now the Lord of the Rings, air quotes, only until Sauron could get there and actually destroy Frodo himself. So it's like, everything had to happen the way that it happened. And Gollum, Smeagol being there at that moment was by design. But at the same time, Tolkien also lamented, like, Gollum almost repented.
Yep.
But except for an unkind word from Sam, we all love Sam. You don't get to see this in the movies, but some unkind word from Sam, and Gollum goes right back to his evil ways, right? And so it's like, that's really tough. That's really tough to grapple with when you look at how are things designed and supposed to play out, and does that include bad things and suffering happening? And sometimes it does. Yeah. For any listener of Booked All Night, come over to ringspodcast.com. That's where you can subscribe to Lore of the Rings. We wander the world and works of J.R.R. Tolkien, and I'd really love to take a look at let's analyze the story for what it is on the page, right? Like, there's plenty of other stuff you could bring to it, and plenty of people do that, and that's fine. But, like, for example, right now, I'm taking each chapter of the Fellowship of the Ring, and I'm only taking about 4 or 5 pages per episode, and every episode's only about 15 minutes long. So we just say, okay, in this small segment of Fellowship of the Ring, what is happening? And we'll look at, like, character motivations and decisions. We'll look at Tolkien's writing style and how that differs from other authors. And, we'll even analyze the poems. I know many people like to skip the songs. They skip the poems, but we're going to analyze those. Yeah, exactly.
Story would not exist without the songs.
Yeah,
it would
literally.
not exist without the songs. Yeah, exactly. So come on over to Lore of the Rings podcast. We'll wander the world and works of J.R.R. Tolkien. You can find me easily at ringspodcast.com. Tap that listen button, find whatever podcast player you love, and come wander Middle-earth with me. Well, I just feel a little bit bad. We didn't hear much from Maggie tonight. I don't know, Maggie. Are you
been kind of quiet, man?
Yeah, that's okay. I feel like I should have disclosed this at the beginning of the recording, but my only interaction with Lord of the Rings has been watching the movies backwards and in Polish. And reading The Hobbit. I did read The Hobbit, but I have not yet read any of the actual movies. Yeah.
That is a very unique way to experience the movies.
Yeah.
And I'll say, Maggie, you are exactly the person that I made my podcast for, which is you've seen the movies and you haven't read the books. Well, let's read the books in like 10 to 15 minute sections so you don't get too overwhelmed with Lord of the Rings lore, but just enough for you to appreciate the story that Tolkien gave us outside of the Peter Jackson films.
During your pitch, I actually was about to open a tab to your podcast so I can be like, ooh, I'll listen to this tomorrow.
Do it. Then you'll understand all of my BS humor that comes out because I make constant... Oh, my goodness. In fact, like, you should come down and we can watch the old Rankin Bass films.
Oh, no, don't do it. Don't do it. It's a trap.
That's a wrap on this episode of Booked All Night. We'd love for you to be a part of the conversation, so don't forget to rate the show, drop a comment, and share your thoughts in the episode poll. And remember, subscribing means you'll never miss an episode or interview as we launch into more amazing stories together. Booked All Night is produced by Rob Cook and his cats. So when you share your favorite episode, be sure to tag us at Booked All Night Pod on Threads, Instagram, and Facebook, and say hi to our guy in the sound booth. For more information, like reading schedules and dates on our upcoming interviews, check out the link in the show notes. That's link.bio/bookedallnight. lnk.bio/bookedallnight for those of you who don't check the show notes. Until next time, my little Libernauts, this is Jessica Mary, Kay Lee, Magdalyn Ann, and producer Rob signing off and reminding you to stay booked all night.